Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and today is part one, the kickoff of Operation Bad Wolf. Now, if you don't know why I'm calling it Operation Bad Wolf, it's because my Mini, I call it Bad Wolf Mini. My wife got me this plate. I'm a big Doctor Who fan, and it just kind of stuck. So I figured it was the perfect name for the operation to bring this Mini into the next chapter of its life. Now, as many of you know, this Mini runs. It has been running, and I drive it basically all the time, and it's extremely difficult for me to take apart a working Mini. But for those of you who don't know, a few months back, my drive shaft fell apart while I was driving, and I got new nylon cups, a new U-joint system, replaced it, did a video on that, and then at the CMU event, which if you haven't seen, a link should pop up in the corner here, it was a really good time, but my drive shaft fell apart again, and I'm not quite clear on why it did it. There's some sort of gremlin down there that is causing all sorts of mayhem, because many people are in the business of taking these cars, restoring them to original spec, and then selling them. For me, this car is a lifelong investment. It's not something that I'm interested in selling. It's not something that I plan to sell at any point in my life. And I want this thing to be the perfect car for me. So what that means is that after almost 10 years of owning this car, I've learned a lot about what I want in a Mini. And this project is going to take this car and make it perfect. So I'm really excited to bring you guys along on this journey. It's going to be lots of fun, and it's probably going to have a lot of headaches at some points, and it's kind of the name of the game. As of right now, I know for sure I'm going to be cleaning up the engine bay. I'm going to take the motor back out, switch it for CVs. I'm going to repaint the motor, and hopefully this time the motor will not flake. I don't know why the paint flaked on the motor before. It must have just been down to improper preparation. Is usually the cause for something like that. I thought I prepped it enough, but evidence is I didn't. In addition to that, I'm going to be pulling the rear subframe. I'm going to show you guys what the process is of taking something like that out of your car is. And then once it's out, I'm going to be revitalizing and restoring that. It's got a ton of surface rust on it. The front subframe was coated in something called Por 15. This stuff is basically like tar. It is incredibly strong, and I've not had a single issue with flaking on the front. But for some reason, past Cole made the stupid decision not to do it on the rear subframe too. So that will be coming out. We will be stripping all the rust off of that and then going through, and I'll be coating that with Por 15 as well. While I'm back there, while I'm doing all of these things, I'm going to be replacing, repairing, and fixing up all the things that have worn down over the last 10 or so years. So without further ado, let's dive into the front, because that's the stuff I'm going to start taking apart first. And yeah, let's see how far we can get in this first episode. Well, we're certainly getting closer to the point of no return. Now, before we keep going, I want to show you guys something on this motor. I probably put about 400 miles on my car in the span of like 2 days. It probably would have been closer to 500 or 600 had I been able to drive the last day. But the last day I actually got to drive, there was so much gravel and dust and everything on the road. And if you can see here, let's just go ahead and do a nice wipe test there. That is how much dust and gravel got sucked into the front of this car. I mean, anything that had oil on it, the dust and gravel stuck to and just completely coated the inside of this engine bay. So even though it kind of sucks that all that stuff is all over the front of the car, it is a really nice opportunity, since I'm going to be pulling the motor out, to get in and clean all of that stuff. So that is awesome. But anyways, let's keep moving along. I'm going to get this oil cooler unhooked, and I'm just going to keep moving along, pulling stuff off of the front of the car. But actually, you know what? Before I keep going along here, I think I'm going to jack the car up and I'm going to drain the oil out. That way I can start taking apart this stuff and not have to worry too much about getting it dirty. Now I actually got to thinking, before I start opening up the motor and getting it exposed to the elements and everything, I mean, I don't necessarily have to take this off, but I think I'm gonna try and get all this stuff cleaned first. I don't want to introduce all this grime and gunk into the motor. So let's get some brake cleaner and really get this sucker clean. One nice thing about knowing that you're gonna repaint your motor is that putting this brake cleaner on it really doesn't matter all that much, because it'll just take the paint off, which will make my life a little bit easier here in the future. Now one of the things that I'm doing while I'm taking all this stuff apart, because really this part is just basically unbolting stuff. If you are taking something apart, put the bolts and nuts back where you found them. Even if you use new hardware, at the end of the day, having this nut and bolt together with this bracket is going to be a lifesaver. Same thing with the alternator, for example. As you can see, I'm putting the bolts back where I found them on the alternator. I might get a new alternator, but these are going to make sure that I don't lose them and that I will be able to reassemble this when the time comes. Now one thing that I'd strongly recommend doing in the event that you have a distributor that you're going to reuse is, one, take a photograph of all of the wiring down here so that you have a reference of how it's all connected before you take it apart. In my case, as you can see, it's kind of a mess down here, but I've got some extra cables. This goes to the alternator. That's pretty clear. I don't need to label that. But I can see here that these two lines go directly to the distributor as it sits now. Personally, I have a little electronic dizzy in here, but I'm going to be replacing my distributor with a 123 distro, which is a fully computerized system. But if you're not doing that, take a Sharpie and make a small mark on your distributor here so that you can see where it was. That way it's already aligned with where it needs to be with timing. You can always adjust it a little bit if necessary later on down the road, but having it set up ahead of time saves you a lot of time and a lot of headache. In my case though, I'm just going to rip this sucker out. There's no point in marking that. The 123 distro is going to take a whole set of timing anyway. So let's take a photograph of these wires just so I have a reference, and then we'll keep plugging along. Now one thing you're going to want to keep in mind about this hole is that while there is a gear linkage in there, this is technically open to your oil compartment. So I'm going to take some latex glove, I'm going to stuff it down in there, I'm going to clean this out before I do, but I want to make sure that it remains clean and I don't introduce contaminants into my motor. Now that's good for now, but a better solution would have been something like painter's tape, but I'm actually out of that right now, so that'll just have to do. And then we can start draining the oil system and getting this ignition coil and all that stuff disconnected. Now that's not too bad. A few little metal shavings on this, but not really all that bad. Gonna get that filter out after this drains out. Now, as you can probably see from where we stopped at the time lapse, I'm in the process of taking my oil cooler out. I just wanted to mention a couple things that are different on my car than on other people's cars. Right here is an adjustable oil proportioning valve. After my last engine failure, because of contaminants in the oil, I put in one of these. This actually allows me to regulate the oil pressure manually and determine when the bypass valve that sits right down inside here opens and closes. So as you can see, it's screwed out quite a bit right now to allow kind of a sweet spot of pressure, and this is going to stay in for right now. I'm going to take it out later, But you'll also see a braided line right here. This goes to my oil pressure gauge, and that is just, it tells me what my current oil pressure is. So I'm going to take this braided line off, and then hopefully I'll be able to get to this fitting for the oil cooler. If not, then I'll have to take it off of the oil cooler side. Not the end of the world. But yeah, so let's keep plugging away. All right, so I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, man, there's like no rhyme or reason to what you're doing here on the engine. And honestly, you'd be pretty much correct. I am just moving through each one of these bolts and nuts. I am taking them off one by one, organizing them as they come off camera, which I'll show you guys in a little bit once I get it all organized in my room. And yeah, we're gonna get all of this stuff off so that we can pull the motor. I've done this a few times, so I have a pretty good idea of where things go, but taking this stuff apart is definitely the easier of the steps. Putting it back together is where it gets hard. That's why it's so important for you guys to organize these bolts, label them, bag them, all of that stuff as you're starting to take it apart. That way they don't get lost, they don't get mixed up with anything once it all has to go back in the car. So I hope that makes sense. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about taking this stuff off because frankly there's not a lot of detail I can go into. It's simply removing bolts. Next, I think I'm going to take this starter off. Let's make sure that you guys can see that. Oh yeah, that's in great view. So one thing that you're going to want to do, which I didn't do actually before I started unplugging all this stuff, is removing the leads on your battery. And in my case, I'm going to actually remove the battery entirely. I'm going to get a little trickle charger so that way my battery doesn't die while this car is not running and sitting. So I'm going to go and grab that battery out and I'll put that in my room. All right, the battery has been disconnected. I can't actually get it out of the battery hole that's back there because I wedged it in so tight, which I guess is a good thing. But I will be now removing these here. So I'm not going to shock myself because I removed that battery already. All right, so that right there is a non-pre-engaged starter. This thing's heavy, like really heavy. So looks good, looks like a starter. This thing has been with me since the beginning, and honestly, I might just keep it. I don't know, I'm gonna do some research and see if I can find a smaller non-pre-engaged starter. We shall see. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do today, I think, is going to be removing the carburetors back here. They have been leaking something fierce, and I can't quite get them tuned. I think the jets are leaking on the bottom. So those definitely need to come out. And the process is pretty simple. Just like with everything else, you have to remove the fuel line and then remove the bolts holding on the carbs onto the manifold, and then remove the manifold from the block. And it's all pretty straightforward. They're just nuts and bolts. But I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys how to take these apart. And specifically, I'm not gonna disconnect the throttle cable from the linkage. That is one thing that I hate to adjust, and you can actually keep it all connected so that when it goes back in, it's ready and you don't have to fiddle with the throttle at all. So that'll be staying on. The linkage will be staying together because that's all in pretty good shape. And then the carbs are going to be rebuilt with a kit that I've got. I'll cover those in later episodes. But for right now, I'm going to pull this sound deadening out, and I'm going to get more room back here and then unbolt everything. Now, like I said before, I kept the throttle and linkage connected. That way I can lift it out, leave it all connected up here like this. There's the one bolt that mounts to the manifold through this little bracket, but this can now set and just dangle down here in my engine compartment where it won't be damaged or have to get readjusted, which is going to be really nice. Now with that, I think we've made some pretty damn good progress. Got the carbs off, got basically everything in the front of the motor off. I still have to drain my coolant. I haven't decided whether or not I'm going to do that before I pull the motor. The coolant's not that heavy, and I think that it will be easier to drain it once it's out. And then we can start moving on to the drive shaft and stuff next. So I'm going to run in, I'm going to organize all these parts, and then I'll give you a little rundown, and then I think that'll be it for Operation Bad Wolf Part 1. All right, so that wraps up this episode of the Operation Bad Wolf. I hope you guys liked it. It's kind of a new format. I'm not going into a lot of detail of this disassembly process. I will go into buckets of detail when I start to put everything back together, but disassembly is pretty straightforward. Undo bolts, organize the bolts, and I cannot emphasize enough that you should organize your bolts, take photographs of the wiring as you start to disassemble it. That way you know where everything goes when you put it back together and you don't lose anything. For example, I have taken even the smallest stuff, this distributor clamp that holds it in place, the 2 bolts that came off it, as well as the clamp, all go into a little baggie, and I label those bags. So where you can, put the bolts back in the holes that they came out of, or organize them into little baggies like this. You will thank me later if you're doing something like this on your car. And frankly, it's a great practice to get into no matter what job and no matter the scale of the job that you're doing on your Classic Mini. But I think we made a huge dent in disassembly on this motor. I'm thinking that once I get Justin's 998 finished and I get the rest of the stuff disassembled on this, we'll be able to pull that motor and really get going on the front end of this car. I think I'm going to do the project in 2 stages where I do the front end of the car first, and then I'm going to move into the back end of the car. That way I'm not overwhelmed with the amount of parts that I've got laying all over the place, and it helps me focus on making things really right in each respective place. So first things first, the more complicated end, I'm going to start with the front, and so obviously I've got the motor disassembled. I'd love to hear ideas from you guys. Some of the things I know I want to do are switch out that oil cooler. I want one with AN lines, and MED Engineering actually carries one that looks really, really nice. I got to get in contact with them about that and see if I can use it with a remote oil filter housing. That is also something that I'm really curious about. I'm wondering if it's something that's worth doing, if I can also use that with the oil cooler that they sell. Having the oil filter off to the side versus down in a really hard to get spot would make my life a lot easier when I am changing the oil on this car. These are the little things that I want to do to the car that will really change the kind of quality of life about working on this car. After that, really the only other thing that I know I want to do is change out all of the lines, including the coolant and breather system lines, with braided stainless lines, hopefully black or a black and blue combination. I think it would look really, really nice, tidy up everything down in there. Who knows, maybe even weld on an AN fitting for that breather housing. Who knows? Who knows? That's all stuff in the future and I am looking into. But I would love to hear what you guys think I should do on the car and to see if it's anything that I want to kind of incorporate into this build. As many of you know, I was at that CMU event and my drive shaft fell apart again. There's some little gremlin that's coming up there and biting that drive shaft and blowing it apart. I haven't quite figured it out, and honestly, I probably won't. I've got CV parts already. I'm going to switch out the differential for the outputs, cover all that later. Don't worry, I'm not going to leave that out of the upcoming episodes, but definitely a CV conversion here in my future. But anyways, if you guys like this build, if you like what I'm doing here and you want to support the channel or you want to help me pay for some of the parts that I'm going to be using on this build, head over to patreon.com/classicminidiy or head over to my merch store where you can pick up cool things and your money goes straight back into this channel to buy filming equipment, parts for the car, or whatever is necessary to help me deliver these videos to you guys. So thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you guys on the next episode of Operation Bad Wolf or the 998 Rebuild. See you guys soon.